Hi, everybody. This is Troy Makanovich, and welcome to another installment of the CWR 7-minute video series. Today, we're going to be talking a little bit about source work, working with scholarly sources and other kinds of sources. First, we'll talk a little bit about something you might be familiar with, the idea of primary sources versus secondary sources and tertiary sources. But I've never found that particularly useful. And so we're going to talk a little bit about a different way of thinking about sources, to B.E.A.M sources. And then we're going to compare the two at the end. As always, there's a handout that's a link to this video that goes along with the video. The first half of the handout is really just kind of a refresher of a lot of the stuff we'll be talking about, so you can print it out and keep it with you. The back side of the handout, though, is a source matrix, and that'll be useful for an upcoming video. So first, if we're just thinking about primary, secondary, and tertiary sources, we start with primary. And primary sources are the data sources that you're using that you will be analyzing and making your own arguments. So these could be things like videos, journal entries, newspapers, photographs. They are sources that you're not so much communicating with as you are examining and interrogating in order to make your own arguments. When you make your own arguments, you're making them as secondary scholarship. You're using the primary sources to make some sort of argument in the form of a manuscript or a journal article or a research paper. So this is what we'd call quote-unquote scholarly sources. Oftentimes people use the term scholarly sources to also refer to a peer review process that can happen usually at the journal level, but sometimes in edited collections as well. But then beyond that, the contributions from those scholarly sources can be assembled into tertiary sources, and these things like textbooks or encyclopedias. So oftentimes they won't have nearly the depth of information that a scholarly source would have, or secondary source, pardon me, but tertiary sources will collect a lot of information. So think of something like Wikipedia, which actually combines a lot of primary and secondary sources. So this is what we call a substantive model of sources. It talks about what a source is, it's either primary or secondary, rather than what it does. But that can be kind of tricky to parse out sometimes, what a source is. And truly, sources can be multiple things depending on how to use them. So as an example, let's say I was writing about the history of high school biology textbooks in the United States. The textbooks by themselves can be considered tertiary sources, but I'm using them as primary sources, and it gets complicated. So rather than worrying about that, why don't we think about what the source does for us? And so that's where we arrive at this. It's by Joseph Bizup, and it's this article called B.E.A.M, a rhetorical vocabulary for teaching research-based writing. And really, I want to emphasize the rhetorical vocabulary part, because it offers a functional model of what to do with sources, how you can consider sources for what you're going to use them for, rather than what they are by themselves. To my mind, this allows for a kind of greater, more explicit acknowledgement of the different ways that you can use a single source. So I might use a source because of its particular methodological contributions, while another scholar might care more about the background information that it provides. So B.E.A.M is an acronym, so let's talk a little bit about what each of those letters stand for. First, the B is for background sources. So this is information you take for granted. As Bizup says here, it's material whose claims you accept as fact, whether they're taken as kind of general information or information that you want to support the writer's own assertions. So here's an example of that from a piece on health disparities in drug and alcohol use disorders. And you see for all of the footnotes or endnotes that they include here, they're about general statistics that they're really not interrogating at all. They're not arguing that every year nearly 1.4 million arrests of juveniles and more than 250,000 cases result in detention. They're just taking that for granted. This is actually from the introduction of the piece, so they're using this kind of as a hook to get you in. If you're not using it as a background, you might be using a source as an exhibit source. So this is a material that you want to explicate, you want to analyze, you want to interpret. You have to do rhetorical work on these sources for them to make sense, have meaning, and have significance. I like to think of these as the evidence for the argument that you're going to make in your writing. Here's an example from a piece about Lady Gaga fan identification. And here you can see that they're using Gaga's Twitter bio as an exhibit source. They're reading it as something that they can analyze. They're not necessarily taking the information for granted, but at the same time, they're not also communicating with it at the same level, right? They are using that source to make their own arguments. In terms of arguments, there are also sources that you might want to use as argument sources. These are materials whose whose claims a writer affirms or disputes or refines or extends in some way. So I like to think about this as the conversation you are entering. These are your peers in the conversation, whereas primary sources are kind of the fodder for that conversation. So here's an example from Brett Colasacco from Men into Gods, and you see at 2 points here, he names authors by names. Indeed, Griffin has shown, so on and so forth. However, as Stanley Payne has observed, so on and so forth. So he's kind of giving you a sense of these are what the main contributions to this argument are, and presumably going to set up for his own contributions down the road. Next and lastly, we have method sources, and these include sources where you're going to draw from them procedures or models or methodologies or theoretical frameworks. So here's an example, specifically about writing across the curriculums, writing within the disciplines, where someone's describing the framework of an institutional ethnography and identifying, you can see in the last sentence there, throughout this article, we have chosen to use institutional ethnography, so on and so forth. So a method source in this case is really a source that you derive that kind of operating principle, whether it be a theory, whether it be a specific procedure you're using, what have you. When you compare these two, they don't map onto each other particularly easily, right? Primary sources, secondary, and tertiary can be each of them themselves, either background, argument, method, or exhibit sources. But there are some generalities I think are worth pointing out. First, for primary sources, more often than not, you're going to be using them as exhibit sources. They are kind of the fodder to make your own argument. At the same time, though, you might get some background information from them, especially from like journalistic sources. In terms of secondary scholarship, those can really run the gamut. Often, I think you're using them for argument and methodology, but you can also grab background information from them. And then if you're doing like a meta-analysis, they are going to be the exhibits. You are going to be analyzing the specific secondary sources. Tertiary sources, though, are generally for background information. They do include argument, though, of course, that's a little bit less substantive than the argument you'll be getting from secondary scholarship. But this is really all kind of background to prepare for the another video we're doing on literature reviews specifically. So feel free to click on over to that. Here are some general references and resources we have on sources. The first being information just about primary, secondary, and tertiary sources from the American Public University System. There's some really good links in there that go into the differences of how these sources are classified between disciplines. And then here's a link to, or a citation, pardon me, for the BIZIP source as well. So as always, thank you for watching, and please join us again.